The Spanish film industry has seen world-class actors and directors come and go. It has seen British and American cinema utilize its locations for the finest of settings, but the Spanish film industry has also undergone a tumultuous whirlwind of events since its inception in 1897. To understand the Spanish film industry, one has to begin where it begun, and that would be 1895. In this specific year, there was no Spanish film industry. In fact, there was no director or actor of that nationality currently working. What took film to Iberian shores was the exhibition hosted by the Lumiere brothers, pioneers of the first photo-motion cameras. The success of this exhibition spread around the country as spectators and creatives alike were taken aback by this innovation. Fast forward 2 years and Spain had released 4 films, all funded by the Spanish film industry, all by homegrown directors. Attributing perhaps one film as the first though is tricky, since the dates are skewed and largely lost in history, although the 4 inaugural Spanish films are as follows: Riña en un café, Plaza del Puerto en Barcelona, Llegada de un tren de Teruel a Segorbe, and Salida de la Misa de 12 de la Iglesia del Pilar de Zaragoza. Those are some very long titles. These films were innovative as they were the first, enabling the Spanish public to feel proud and somewhat elated at what their country had produced. These were the simpler times in Spain, and as things developed, the industry would never see calmer days. Most directors remained local, allowing Spain a pool of the highest quality. But then as the years passed by and the quality heightened, this was no longer. Segundo de Chomón was the first Spanish filmmaker to ply his trade abroad, namely Italy and France, during a period where those nations were the highest grossing and most successful outputs of cinema. Chomón still made films in Spain, but he fluctuated between those few countries as he became a renowned pioneer of cinema. Throughout this early period, Barcelona had been elected the hub of the Spanish film industry, this up until 1914. Films were produced and shot in the region too, but by the 1920s, Madrid had then become the hub, and at that point 38 of the 44 films produced in Spain were created in Madrid. This would, at a later stage, help right-wing nationalist and dictator Franco funnel political propaganda through the film industry during the Spanish Civil War. The 1920s saw the outbreak of the visionary Luis Buñuel, arguably one of the finest filmmakers to have ever manned a director's chair. Buñuel created Un Chien Andaluz in 1929, one of the first cinematic masterpieces. He worked with esteemed Spanish artist Salvador Dali to concoct this surrealist picture. Buñuel would forever play a key part in the progression of Spanish cinema, especially politically. In 1931, sound was introduced in the Spanish film industry. A positive, yes, in the long run, but definitely not short term. This was due to current Spanish filmmakers being forced into changing their equipment and abandoning the silent film era. A key example of this struggle to transition was seen in 1931, as only one film was put to screen all year. This erratic nature of production lasted 4 years, all the way through to 1935, until Manuel Casanova inaugurated the Compañía Industrial Film Española, better known as Cifesa. His company introduced a high quality of sound to Spanish cinema, and that's when a true progression would be seen in the industry. The Spanish Civil War is Spain's darkest and most bleak moment in history, as right-wing nationalists and left-wing independists brutally savaged the nation and one another due to political disagreements. This rippled into the Spanish film industry. In fact, ripple kind of downplays that. The Spanish industry felt the full force of the violence and political censorship that the Civil War had exuded. The Civil War deeply hurt the Spanish film industry's production rates and economy too. Only 9% of films made prior to 1936 survived the war, which is why some films are now impossible to find or have skewed release dates. The celluloids of these pictures were destroyed and turned into other materials to help with the war. In addition to destroying what was the very pinnacle of Spanish filmmaking at the time, the Civil War also saw right-wing nationalists overtake Spanish production companies to inject their propaganda into upcoming films. In fact, the previously mentioned Cifesa, Spain's largest production company, were forever at the mercy of the right wing. Most of their pictures would begin with propaganda such as a newsreel promoting the positives of the right and negatives of the left. This stifled the creativity of filmmakers, forcing them to be politically correct and ensure that their film's politics aligned with whichever party their production company sided with. Though in fairness to Cifesa, they also introduced and gave a platform to the likes of Luis Buñuel to establish his cinematic voice at such a young age. Pro-Franco supporters also funded the National Department of Cinematography in Spain, yet another downfall of the industry. Why? This meant that most left-wing creatives were forced to go into exile. Actors, directors, cinematographers, those who remained were largely conscripted to inject right-wing propaganda into their work. During this era, Luis Buñuel released one of his 3 very controversial Spanish films, España 1936. This short documentary was groundbreaking as it broke the tussle between political parties and focused heavily on the horrors that they had created. Rather than impress a political bias into the final product, like many films back then were forced to do, Buñuel simply presented the collateral damage of these warring factions, the death of innocent families, pedestrians, and also torture. The legendary director bypassed Spanish regulations by having the film produced in France by a communist party. When the war ended, the Spanish film industry had induced a rupture of events. It would never be the same as it had been prior to this catastrophe. People were reluctant to broker deals with Spanish production companies, filmmakers were afraid of returning after exile in fear of losing their jobs, and comedies were the only mass-produced genre in order to lift the mood of the nation. But Spain needed more than just comedies to remedy their status as a filmic country, and that's why the 50s may very well be the turning point in Hispanic film history. Social criticism arrived in the 1950s after a long period of drab comedies. Enter Juan Antonio Bardem. The director criticized the nation's industry for refusing to talk about the issues still plaguing Spain after the war: financial disparity, increase of violence, unemployment, cynicism of the upper class, hopelessness of the lower. This was important and groundbreaking because of Spain's political censorship and regulations in cinema. So Bardem and a few other directors decided to lace their work with social commentary behind a veil of traditional storytelling. Black comedies, satirical dramas, and highbrow criticism began to skyrocket, and the population of Spain quickly connected with an important series of films, particularly Muerte de un ciclista, or The Death of a Cyclist. Every social cog of contemporary Spain was exposed and explored. During this period, more cinematic voices entered the Spanish fray. Other dialects and regions in the country were allowed to create their own pictures. This meant that Catalonia, Galicia, and the Basque country were now allowed to implement a new voice in the industry. The Catalan and Basque spoke of their mistreatment during the Spanish Civil War, a period where their people were told to identify as Spanish or simply be sentenced to prison or worse. The rise of Catalonia and the Basque country in the Spanish film industry has seen the rise of many excellent directors: Jaime Chavarri, Juanma Ulloa, Julio Medem, and more. With all of these independent and different voices, Spain loosened its grip in regards to censorship in film. During these 2 decades, Spain focused less on their own products and decided to join up with Italy, France, and the United States. What this meant was a lack of Spanish films, but a high influx of foreign cinema utilizing the country for its settings and locations. The Spanish film industry started making a high amount of money after classic films such as A Fistful of Dollars were regularly used in the country to shoot their scenes. But it wasn't only Italy seeking out Spanish soil. Hollywood soon came knocking by, and prestigious names such as Orson Welles, Betsy Blair, and Ava Gardner found themselves working in the country. In fact, the former and the latter spent a period of their lives living in Spain. What this did was make people more aware of the country, but perhaps not for the right reasons. While the locations were gorgeous, nobody really knew about Spanish cinema. The country was merely a scenic landscape for other nations. Local directors were ignored or simply funded poorly, which decreased the cinematic voice of the country. Yet in 1962, José María Escudero became the owner of the Escuela Oficial de Cine, the country's first ever film school. This gave a voice to independent and left-wing filmmakers and saw an outburst of excellence. Among these filmmakers were Mario Camus, Miguel Picasso, and Carlos Saura. While the production industry were ignoring and swatting away Spaniards, schools were empowering those rejected. Buñuel, on the other hand, continued his powerful and controversial filmography by acquiring funding from other countries. This enabled him to release Viridiana and Tristana, 2 films that speak of Spain's disconnect with religion and also concocts tainted religious imagery that swept the nation. Many were offended, with the industry coming under obscene amounts of scrutiny for allowing these films to enter the nation. But the films also had their fans, and that number has only increased over the years as both films have strengthened with their commentary and criticisms. By the time the 1980s crept around, Spain became more aware of its own filmmakers. In the late 1980s, the Spanish film industry realized that it had ignored its own for far too long. So 2 things were introduced. Television companies were now encouraged to fund Spanish cinemas. This has since become a compulsory rule. And the Goya Awards had its inauguration. The Goya Awards are the country's answer to the Oscars or BAFTAs. This is limited to just Spanish voices in cinema though, with various awards handed out to costume designers, screenwriters, editors, actors, cinematographers, and directors. In essence, this empowers Hispanic filmmakers and also validates their hard work work across the globe and inside the country. With this recognition of their achievements, the Spanish film industry has come leaps and bounds. Independent films are given more coverage, blockbusters are given that extra bit of money to create something special. In the 90s, Spain began to witness a high entry of horror films in the cinematic circuit. Why? Well, a once extremely Catholic nation had now seen a mixture of religions enter it. This, paired with the rise of atheism and objection of religious belief, meant that political constraints were lifted. Religion could now be played with, and signs of satanic, ungodly terror was finally allowed as a creative outlet. With this, Alex de Iglesias' El Día de la Bestia, or The Day of the Beast, became one of the highest grossing films in 1995, the first anti-Christ picture funded by the Spanish film industry. This film saw a heavy metal enthusiast and a psychiatrist aid a priest in his seeking of the child Antichrist during Christmas. You can already see how blasphemous this film may have been to some, but the nation reacted to it a lot better than Buñuel's films in the 60s and 70s. This not only shows the progression of the country's political censorship, but also the exceeding rejection of religious belief. And this rejection is also supported by modern films such as The Orphanage, Spain's highest grossing film of 2007, another horror movie. The industry has now enforced a rule whereby almost any Spanish film has to be funded by a television station, be that the nation's titanic TVE or smaller regional stations such as the Televisión de Galicia. You can now find over 4,000 theatrical screens scattered around the country, with Madrid's Cine Capital the most prestigious complex. And now Spanish cinema is gaining recognition abroad. During this period, the country has seen 3 films granted a Best Foreign Language Film Oscar.
And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to Belle Époque.
España for Mar Adentro.
All about my mother.
And countless other triumphs in the screenplay, cinematography and makeup departments too. Very few nations can boast a wider yield during this period, and that's a true testament to the quality of filmmaking in Spain. Today you have directors like Jaume Collet Serra and Juan Antonio Bayona creating big budget films in America, and of course the incomparable Pedro Almodóvar, as much a darling of Spain as he is a stalwart of foreign cinema on British and American shores. As for actors, everybody knows Penélope Cruz and Javier Bardem. In fact, these two have won and had multiple nominations in the Oscar Awards. They feature heavily in both Spanish cinema as well as the more American produce. To list other names would be to prolong this video to a 1-hour special, so I'll leave it at that. The sky's the limit for Spanish cinema. With the correct funding and expert creatives at the helm, the industry could improve even more in the coming years, and the horror genre may very well be the face of this renaissance.